State Correctional Institution, Green. This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
I was in over my head, and when I was 16 years old, I got involved in an incident that resulted in a young woman being killed who was the wife of a drug dealer. And I was arrested, and I was sentenced to life without parole.
My brother didn't participate in the murder of the woman, nor did he witness it. Because of the laws here in Pennsylvania, he was considered as guilty as those that physically committed the crime. Mandatory life without the possibility of parole, 26 years ago.
His story is not unique. There are many individuals across the state of Pennsylvania and across the country who have been likewise serving decades in prison because of a very, very harsh penalty scheme that I think we can now finally recognize just went awry. My interest in juvenile justice started when I was in law school. I just came to recognize that law was a very powerful tool for social change and social justice in this country. And I came to believe that children were one of the populations within the United States who really had no voice.
I met Marsha Levick when I was a law student 35 years ago. And the Juvenile Law Center was really ahead of the rest of the nation on this question of protecting children.
Children's rights were pretty nascent in 1975. The U.S. Supreme Court had only decided 7 or 8 years earlier that children actually had a constitutional right to counsel in delinquency proceedings. So we saw the field of children's rights as something that needed definition.
There was traditionally an assumption that juvenile offenders were very different from adults and they were dealt with in the juvenile court. But in the 1990s, there was a very punitive law reform movement that rejected that notion that there was any difference between juvenile offenders and adults.
What's been so exciting and really game-changing about the last 10 years in our field is that we now have a vocabulary of developmental science, of neuroscience, that has both allowed us to really put a name and a label and a set of scientific terms on what those differences are.
The explanation for why adolescents tend to engage in risk-taking behavior that most scientists seem to accept is that the part of the brain that relates to sensation-seeking and risk-taking seems to sort of awaken around puberty. But the parts of the brain that control self-regulation, planning, develop much more slowly through the course of adolescence and into young adulthood. And so, one psychologist described it as being like starting the engines without a good set of brakes.
Judges Mark Chivarella and Michael Conahan arrived at the federal courthouse.
Prosecutors accused them of sending juveniles to a privately run detention center.
The evidence against the former judges was compiled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation
In a scandal known as Kids for Cash.
Kids for Cash is really an incredibly important story about what happens when systems break down for children.
It started as a complaint about juveniles being denied their rights, specifically in my case, my right to an attorney.
Her mother, Lorene, called us to tell us that her daughter had just been recently adjudicated up in Wilkesboro and had been removed from her home and put into a juvenile correctional facility. That was literally the 40th anniversary of the United States Supreme Court decision in Ray Galt, in which the U.S. Supreme Court had said children have a right to counsel in delinquency proceedings. 4 decades later, the right was being flagrantly violated day in and day out in a courtroom 2 hours north of Philadelphia.
And they found out that money was changing hands.
We know now that the judges accepted about $2.9 million from these very facilities in which the judge was placing children, and it ultimately reflected ways in which the system had been broken across the country.
There was a time in this country in the recent past where people were going around arguing that some children aren't children. And I think we allowed that narrative to create some really bad policies, and we began demonizing a generation of children, mostly poor kids and kids of color. And we actually accepted this very false idea that some children were super predators, they were monsters, they weren't really children. So in 2005, the Supreme Court recognized that treating children like adults for the purposes of the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment. That argument was then extended to life without parole for children convicted of non-homicide offenses. Then it was extended to treating children like adults for the purposes of mandatory life without parole sentences in Miller versus Alabama. And in Miller, the court said, no, for children who are going to change, we cannot impose a mandatory life without parole sentence. It's not consistent with what's fair and just.
When the Miller decision came down, I get emotional now. It was incredible. I cried, and we were just so happy. And then Pennsylvania said that they didn't believe it was retroactive and fought that fight, and it was just devastating.
Montgomery versus Louisiana presented very squarely the question for the U.S. Supreme Court to decide about whether or not all of the jurisdictions across the country, about 28 of them, including Pennsylvania, would be required to extend the benefits of the Miller ruling to all of the individuals serving that sentence.
Marsha played a critical role. I mean, I was actually so relieved when she stepped in because this stuff is really complicated, and she has the breadth and the wisdom and the experience and the perspective needed to help the court kind of see what the court needs to see.
The Supreme Court decided that Miller was retroactive, that offenders who were serving sentences of life without parole under statutes in which that sentence was mandatory were entitled to either resentencing or to parole hearings. Is sort of a culmination of the extraordinary work she's done in constitutional litigation.
We can't overestimate the significance of the Supreme Court's decision in Miller and Montgomery, as well as in Graham and Roper. The combination of these cases has really sparked a rethink about sentencing of children in this country. Within Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, the impact is the most profound. We unfortunately have the largest number of individuals serving a life without parole sentence for homicides convicted under the age of 18 of any state in the country, which means Pennsylvania leads the world because the United States leads the world. And of the 500 housed in Pennsylvania, 300 of them are here in Philadelphia. The implementation of the Montgomery decision will be challenging because we recognize that there are many voices that will come to the table as these individuals are resentenced. We recognize the importance of victims being able to participate in this process.
It's giving us a second chance. And I think that's really important because as many of us that were kids, that were juveniles, we didn't even have a first chance.
She rescued me. I was in trouble, and Marsha Levick and Juvenile Law Center came riding in on white horses to save the day.
There's no one who's had a more important impact on promoting justice for juveniles than Marsha Levick.
I think she represents something really critical in a city like Philadelphia, which has in many ways failed its children. And Marsha has championed the cause of those kids. And to recognize her with this award is to recognize the legitimacy, the value, the virtue of what she has been standing for, fighting for decades.
For the awards committee recognizing that the work that I do, which is really on behalf, in some respects, of a population that society has thrown away, that it would be so easy to forget individuals, even 500 of them. The fact that the awards committee thought that the work that we do here matters, and that it matters at that level, is something that I appreciate enormously.